example. And then one other thing is a married couple will sometimes come to me and sometimes they think that they both need to file. While it's true that when you're married, the other spouse's income and assets do get factored into the bankruptcy equation in various parts, both spouses do not need to file. They can choose to file, and you may want to file together, but there are instances where only one of the spouse really should file. For example, if you're both on the house and the mortgage, and that's the major problem, you get the automatic stay when you file bankruptcy. You may just say, look, having this second spouse file is not going to do anything for me. I'm going to get the automatic stay anyway from either of us filing, and there's really no point in the second person filing. So let's keep that spouse out of bankruptcy, and then we'll discuss which is the one we want to put in and which is the one we want to leave out. So now let's say we've determined that you do need to or want to file a bankruptcy after going through all that. Now we want to look at Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy, which is the one that makes the most sense. And generally speaking, you're going to want to do a Chapter 7 unless one of these things comes up. So Chapter 7, you're going to want to file that as the liquidation chapter unless you've got one of these things. So the first one is you're ineligible for a discharge in a Chapter 7. I actually just got a call this week by someone who wanted to file a Chapter 7 again. They informed me that they had filed with me before, looked at their file, determined their prior filing was just over 7 years from the date that I was getting this phone call. Well, that person was ineligible to get a discharge because they weren't at the 8-year mark. So at that point, the conversation shifted to, okay, if you want to file a Chapter 7, you're going to have to wait it out another 10 months. Now, what can we do to deal with your creditors in those 10 months? So you just may be ineligible for a discharge. And it's very, very, very rarely makes sense to file a Chapter 7 when you're ineligible for a discharge. Then you may have not enough dischargeable debt for Chapter 7, or you need a repayment plan. What that means is you may have a ton of debt, but 90% of it you're not going to get rid of in Chapter 7 or 95%. So Chapter 7 is not really going to give you a ton of relief. So Chapter 13 would probably make more sense in that instance. Also, in regards to a repayment plan, you may be up for foreclosure and 12 months behind on your mortgage, and the primary thing you're thinking about is how are we going to keep this house? I need a repayment plan to get caught up. Maybe your income was down and that's what led you to get behind, and now you're in a position where your income's much higher, so you can afford to get caught up. That would be an example of Chapter 13 is going to work more to what you want than Chapter 7. Now, you still may want to do a Chapter 7 and then maybe later do a Chapter 13. I know that sounds strange, but that actually is a strategy that makes sense in a lot of instances. But generally speaking, if your debts are primarily secured debts and you're behind on those and you're trying to keep that house, car, those are the kind of things that are more apt to be a Chapter 13 case than a Chapter 7 case. You may have too much income for Chapter 7. So a couple things about this. One is I'll often get calls from people that said, oh, I'm ineligible for Chapter 7 based on my income. That's not a real thing. There is no too much income makes you ineligible as just a matter of law. There is a thing called a means test that they look at, and we factor in your income, factor in your debts. You get certain kind of debts, get certain kind of deductions, others don't. So mortgage is an important debt. Let's say you had child support, that's an important debt. Whereas other things, you just kind of get a baseline, like your food, your clothing, based on your household size, and you get means tested. So if you otherwise would want to file a Chapter 7, but your income is too high and then your allowable expenses, deductions are too low, and therefore you, under the means test, don't qualify for a Chapter 7, or at least based on a presumption. That is the kind of thing that would, I could tell a client, look, there's really no way that the U.S. Trustee's Office is going to allow you to get away with a Chapter 7 discharge based on your income and your debts. So we need to look at Chapter 13. So according to this means test formula, you can really afford a Chapter 13 repayment plan of $1,000 a month. So I know you'd like to do a Chapter 7, and that would be awesome. You'd get rid of $50,000 in unsecured debt, wouldn't have to do a repayment plan, but your income's too high in comparison to your expenses. So that's a key one. And there is an exception to that, which is non-consumer debt. So you can have someone who otherwise would not squeeze into a Chapter 7 based on their income being too high. But if the majority of their debt is for non-consumer purposes, and this comes up sometimes, let's say you have incurred the majority of your debt for a business purpose. You started your business and you gave all these personal guarantees out, and then the business failed, and now you make some decent income, but you've got all these residual debts from the business that you started and failed. There is an exception to get into a Chapter 7, whereas if the majority of your debt was for credit cards or your home mortgage or something, that exact same fact pattern, exact same income, expenses, you would not get into a Chapter 7. So you do have to look at that. And then we have a thing in bankruptcy called exemptions. So essentially the expression is sort of you get a fresh start, not a head start. So, and this will vary by your state, you get to keep a certain amount of stuff, i.e. exempt a certain amount of stuff. So whenever you're filing Chapter 7, or filing a bankruptcy, to determine if Chapter 7 is the right fit, you got to know ahead of time, before you file the case, whether you are at risk for losing anything. Okay, so for that, we got to look at your assets and what you can keep. And we got to determine that ahead of time before you file, whether that's at risk. Now, there are instances where I have filed Chapter 7s with people who knew going in they were going to lose something, but their debt was so substantial that they still wanted to file a Chapter 7 and see something liquidated. So that's not to say you're never going to file a Chapter 7 if you stand to lose something, but you just want to know ahead of time, hey, if I file a Chapter 7, here's what I stand to lose. Compare the risk reward, and that, depending on how much debt you have and what you get rid of and what asset you would lose, you maybe don't want to file a Chapter 7. For example, let's say here in Georgia, we don't get a large homestead exemption. Let's say you just absolutely don't want to move out of your house and you have $200,000 in home equity or $150,000 in home equity. Then I got to tell you, look, if you're going to file a Chapter 7, you're at great risk of losing your house. So if you want to keep your house and do a bankruptcy, you're going to have to do a Chapter 13 repayment plan. So those are all the things you look at. Now, the third goal is, should we file now or wait? Okay, so there are times where, okay, we've determined Chapter 7 makes sense, we determined there's enough debt, and client's ready to go, but there may be instances where all that makes perfect sense, but you need to wait. Most common example is tax debt. A lot of people don't realize income tax debt can be dischargeable in certain instances in Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I have had people contact me with a large amount of income tax debt that was close to being eligible for a discharge. And by that, I mean, 6 months or less. And the conversation I've had to have with them is, do you realize you can get rid of an extra $30,000, $40,000 in tax debt if you hold off on filing this bankruptcy another 4 months? And now they may have to pick their poison. They may be in a scenario where their house is also up for foreclosure or something where they need to immediately file. But you've got to be aware of what's going on, what could change on the dischargeability scale. Should I wait or should I not? And again, with tax debt, that often comes up that you may want to wait. And this will, of course, depend on how old the tax debt is, how close it's being to discharge, what is the amount of the tax debt. You got to just factor all this. And as the client, you just got to know have your attorney let you know, and then you can do the risk reward yourself. Transfers to third parties or preferences. So sometimes people have given property away to family members in the past year, nefarious reasons or not nefarious reasons. They've also paid a large debt to a creditor that's a family member, again, not nefarious reasons, or a friend, or maybe someone who's not even any of the above, an institutional creditor. There are rules, we call them preferences, where or gift transfers, where you could either be threatening your discharge or threatening that third party by having a trustee come and try to collect against them for things you've given away in the past year or 2 years. This will depend on a variety of factors. So we have to look at what you've given away recently or paid creditors and determine, is any of that at risk to that third party or potentially risking your own discharge? And then we might say, okay, we got to wait. So those are deadlines that are not really arguable. They're set by law, dates. So you've just got to get your dates. You don't approximate, you get the exact dates and determine when, maybe I need to hold off filing this case 2 months. So then income changes. This can work both ways. You could be eligible for the means test now because you had a large period of unemployment in the last 6 months, or the converse, you're ineligible now because you just got laid off. So, and some sort of income changes could impact, maybe you do want to do a Chapter 13, but you can't afford it now. However, you're in line to get a raise. So, but that raise is 6 weeks away. So essentially your income fluctuation could change how this thing works in a variety of factors. Also, wait for a foreclosure date would be another one. I've touched on this earlier, which is, sometimes you're up for foreclosure, but the foreclosure date, and this will vary by your state law. In Georgia, we have non-judicial foreclosure. It goes pretty quick from your notice to the sale date, but in some states it can take a while. So essentially, you have to determine based on the foreclosure date. This is just one example. Okay, I need to file by this day. All right, and that day is 6 weeks away. Well, you could file now, but maybe you want to wait 5 weeks to file because maybe they'll cancel the foreclosure sale, for example. So that's just another factor you want to consider is there immediacy to your filing. All right, and then now we got to figure out how we're going to pay for this. So Chapter 7 fees, attorney's fees are pretty much paid up front before you file the case. Essentially, the attorney pretty much estimates how much work time is going to be put in. Some cases are more complex than others. Like, for example, I mentioned earlier, what if you have some tax debt I got to look at to determine if it's dischargeable? I've got to run an analysis. That is more work than a case with just unsecured credit card debt. So essentially, you're going to get, in a typical case, quoted a flat fee. And you're also going to have a court filing fee, which currently is $338. And some miscellaneous fees, like you have to take an online consumer credit counseling course. But you've got to be able to pay for all this before the case is filed. Now, there are instances where you could have fees incurred after you file in Chapter 7. That's typically if you get sued for an adversary proceeding or have some just additional work, like a redemption motion. But for the most part, your Chapter 7 fees are kind of done and paid for by the time you file your bankruptcy, but you got to come up with the money to pay that. Chapter 13 is more about, it's a repayment plan. You do have to pay a court filing fee of $313 before you file the case, and then this is really going to vary wildly by attorney how much, if any, they're going to require for upfront payment in a Chapter 13. But usually you're going to have to come up with some upfront attorney's fees in Chapter 13 bankruptcy. And then the last thing is you just got to have an understanding of the case as far as redemption, reaffirmation, things like that, meaning you may want to redeem your car if you're filing Chapter 7. I'm just giving one example. You may want to redeem your car in Chapter 7, which means purchase it at the fair market value. So let's say you have a car that you owe $5,000 on and it's worth $1,000. You can buy that in Chapter 7 for $1,000. So you want to know ahead of time with your attorney, what is the strategy? Are we going to do that? Well, if you're going to do that, now you need to discuss how are you going to come up with the $1,000. Additionally, you may invoke a strategy where you don't file the redemption motion until 2 or 3 months into your case. You use the automatic stay during that time. So you don't need to come up with $1,000 right away to redeem that vehicle. So, and